Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is It Follows. Now, It Follows came out in 2015, and the film is written and directed by David Robert Mitchell. Now, before this, he also directed a film called The Myth of the American Sleepover. Now, I just want to say right off the bat that I freaking love It Follows, and this was actually one of my top 10 favorite films to come out in 2015, and in my opinion, this movie next to the 2014 film The Babadook are the two best horror films to come out in the last 5 or 6 years, in my opinion. But you also had some really good horror films coming out this year, 2016, like you had films like The Witch and Green Room and 10 Cloverfield Lane, which I know is a little more mainstream than the other horror films I've just mentioned. And it really seems like horror is making kind of a comeback now, because in the past few years, horror films have been kind of lackluster. I mean, you've had some good horror films to come out in the past couple of years, but I really feel like with movies like this and The Babadook and The Witch and Green Room, like, I really feel like, the more, intellectually driven horror film is starting to make kind of a comeback now, which I really like. Now, the plot of It Follows is it's about this girl named Jay, who in the beginning of the film is seeing this guy, and you realize that they've been dating for some time now, but one night they end up having sex. But it turns out that this guy had some kind of curse on him where he was being followed by some kind of a demon, and if this demon got to him, it would have killed him, but because he had sex with Jay, he passed the curse on to her, and basically it's kind of like a sexually transmitted curse. So now Jay, the main character of the movie, has this curse on her where this creature is following her. And this creature that is following her can actually shapeshift, so it can look like anybody, but only people who have the curse on them can actually see the creature. Now, I call it a curse, but really they don't even use that word in the movie. Now, It Follows, I thought, was a brilliant movie, and the premise of the movie, it does sound a little ludicrous when you first hear it, but the way it's handled in the movie, you really do buy it, even if the premise on the surface sounds a little ridiculous. In the film, you really buy it, and I think that's really thanks to the directing in the movie, and the acting, and the characters, because the characters in this movie are very believable. Like, they really do feel like real people in this movie. And all the acting in this movie is really good, especially from the lead actress who plays Jay. I think her name is Maika Monroe. I hope I'm saying her first name right, but before this, she was in a movie called The Guest, and she's also going to be in that sequel to Independence Day that is coming out pretty soon. And a lot of the other characters in this movie are really likable as well. Like, I really liked the character of Paul, who is a friend of Jay's, who you can tell has a thing for her, but he was a really likable character, and a really believable character too. I know a lot of people like the character of Paul in real life. Now, one thing that I freaking loved about this movie is they never once attempted to explain what this thing actually is. Now, in my plot description of the movie, I referred to the creature as a demon, but they never once actually used the word demon in the movie. Really, you don't know what this thing actually is. You don't know if it's a demon or some kind of a ghost. I actually heard some people theorize that it's actually an alien in the movie, which once again maybe that's not wrong, because they never actually explain what this creature actually is, so you can interpret it as being anything, as being a demon or an alien. Like, it really doesn't matter, because they never actually explain what the creature is. Now, I actually got into, I don't want to say it was an argument, but I got into this debate once about this movie with this guy, and he didn't like how the film never explained what the creature was, because his argument was that he likes things that establish some kind of mythology, and to an extent I can understand that, but I'm comfortable with this movie not explaining what the mythology is. Basically, the way I see it, in this film, the mythology is up to you. The mythology is up to the individual. Like, it's up to your interpretation where this thing actually came from. Now, another aspect of this movie that I thought was very interesting was that the timeline in this movie is very ambiguous. Like, you're not really sure when this movie is supposed to take place. Like, there are a lot of things in this movie that suggest that the movie might take place in the 1980s. Like, there are scenes in this movie where you see the characters watching movies on an old school television set, and there are a lot of other things in this movie that makes it seem like it takes place in the 80s. However, you also see modern day cars in the background, and also in the movie there's this character who is reading books off this device, which is kind of like a Kindle, only it's shaped like a seashell. So it's almost like the film is set in some weird alternate universe where maybe it's the 1980s of this alternate universe, but it's like, what if we had some of the technology that we have now, only back in the 1980s? But that was an aspect of the movie that I thought was really interesting, that it seems like the film is set in some alternate universe, and the timeline of the movie is very ambiguous. Now, I can't possibly talk about this movie without also talking about the score for this movie. The score for this film was absolutely beautiful, and it really did feel like the kind of score that you would hear in a horror film from back in the 80s. It was a very 80s-esque kind of score, but it also felt a lot like a John Carpenter score as well. Like, there were even some parts of the music in this movie that were very reminiscent of Carpenter's Halloween soundtrack. Now, I've heard that David Robert Mitchell's two biggest influences when directing this movie were John Carpenter and George A. Romero, and I definitely see the John Carpenter influence on this movie. Like, this very much feels like a film that Carpenter would have directed back in the 80s. But I also see some influences from Wes Craven in this movie as well. Like, I got a big Nightmare on Elm Street vibe from this film. Like, this film has a lot of similarities to the original Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I know some people who said that they saw kind of an influence of Stanley Kubrick on this movie, and I can definitely see that, like, in terms of how the film is shot, because the film has some beautiful cinematography in it, so I can definitely see some of the influences of Stanley Kubrick on this film, and I also saw some Argento influences on this, and even some influences from Don Coscarelli as well. But although this film was clearly influenced by the films of the directors I've mentioned, it's still a very original film, and it has a premise which I really don't think I've ever seen before. Also, It Follows really is a very stylistically and very artistically directed film. As I said, a lot of the cinematography in this film is actually quite beautiful, but also a lot of the lighting and the colors in this movie makes this film actually quite beautiful to look at. Now, the film does touch on a lot of deeper themes, like sexuality is obviously a major theme within the film, and you can look at the creature in this movie as being almost like a manifestation of a lot of the fears and anxieties that young people have when it comes to sexuality and losing one's virginity. And also, you could look at the creature as being a metaphor for all the negative aspects of sexuality, like STDs and things like that. And you could also look at It Follows as being somewhat of a coming-of-age movie, because in a lot of ways the film is also kind of about the fears and anxieties of growing up, and also sexuality is a big part of growing up and coming of age, so you can look at It Follows as being a very dark take on the coming-of-age story. Now, besides sexuality, death is also a major theme within this film, because death is the one thing that we're all going to have to face eventually, and I really feel like the creature in this movie is kind of a representation of death. You could even look at the creature as being the Grim Reaper if you wanted to, and really I think the film is trying to say that no matter what, we're all going to eventually face death. But yeah, It Follows is an absolutely brilliant horror film. It's very creepy, and it's beautifully shot and beautifully made, and very well acted, and has some genuinely likable and believable characters in it. So I highly recommend It Follows, and even if you don't like this movie, you can't deny, though, that we need more horror films like this, because even if you don't personally like this, you can't deny that they were still trying to make a good movie with this. But yeah, that was my review on It Follows, and bye.